define your terms, because otherwise you'll be talking over each other's heads or using the same word, thinking about something completely different, and so we might even not even know what each other are talking about. So I wrote down a few of the different terms. But start out with epistemology. Epistemology is a field of philosophy. There are three main branches of philosophy. There's epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. We'll be covering the first two primarily. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and what it means to know. Is a proposition true? Well, that's an epistemological claim. What is truth? That is an epistemological question. Metaphysics deals with the nature of reality. So, there are thinking beings in the universe. It's a metaphysical claim. Ontology is it's not really a separate branch, but it kind of is of metaphysics. It deals with what exists, basically. Specifically, it deals with the idea of existence and not necessarily of beings, but also just entities, concepts, laws, etc. A priori is one of the two major types of reasoning. A priori basically deals with things you can know through the mind alone, such as I exist is known a priori. It's known through your mind. A posteriori are claims that are reasoning that deal with the external world, like that chair is green or light blue or whatever. I guess turquoise, well, sort of blue-green. Blue-green, we'll say.
Jungle green.
We can debate about that at length, but that would be something you investigate a posteriori. Deductive reasoning is the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning are kind of obscure, largely because of things like Sherlock Holmes. Like he says, "Oh, I deducted this," but he actually inducted it. But
way to go, Sherlock.
Deductive reasoning basically is you have a series of premises and arguments, like this over here. That is a deductive argument. You start with a premise, go to the next premise, so on, come to the conclusion. If they follow, it's deductively valid. Inductive reasoning looks at a bunch of different instances of something and then makes sort of an extrapolation upon that. So if we see, the skies are cloudy and it rains, and we see that often enough, usually we're going to start grabbing our umbrella because we've been induced that these kinds of clouds usually result in rain. Then we're going to discuss a third type of reasoning, which will be the primary basis for what we're talking about today. And that is abductive reasoning, also known as transcendental reasoning, also known as spiral reasoning. And it's sort of like the reverse of deductive reasoning, where you start with your conclusion and work up backwards to determine what the necessary premises would be. Let's see. Next is apologetics. Comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to construct a defense, like in a court of law. So if you've ever had to explain yourself or defend any particular idea or claim that you've made, you have engaged in apologetics. Specifically, we're going to deal with Christian apologetics today, defending the Christian worldview. And I want to talk about a few different types of apologetics. There's the strong apologetic, which is presenting an argument or evidence that is supposed to convince someone of the truth of your claim. A weak apologetic sort of is made just to show that your claim or your belief is rational. Not necessarily that someone should accept it, but that you are justified in believing what you're claiming. And then the third is what I call a moderate apologetic, in which you satisfy the conditions of a weak apologetic, but also issue a challenge to the person who is opposed to your view. Next part is presuppositions, which is one of the major points of this whole talk. Presuppositions are the basic foundations of your worldview, how you perceive the world, what things exist. Trying to think of what else. Just the general basic ideas that are inherent to the way you perceive and understand the world. Worldview is essentially the collection of all those propositions and presuppositions together, and that makes up how you view reality, your view of reality. One thing I want to touch on is evidentialism. Evidentialism is a type of apologetic where you argue from the evidences existing in the world. and extrapolate upon those and come to conclusions. Sort of what we've been doing a lot of so far in these discussions are evidential arguments. You're looking at the fine-tuning of the universe or whatnot. The reason that so many of us remain unconvinced by these arguments is because we have different presuppositions. We have a different basis for understanding the data that we interpret. So we're looking at the same data, but we come to very different conclusions. That's because our presuppositions are different. So the first thing I want to really discuss is the problem of logic. So as you can see, I've got laws of logic and propositions. Proposition is basically any statement about reality or about truth or about any concept. And generally how it works, for most people at least, try not to knock this chair over, is that for any proposition, we determine whether or not it's true or whether or not it's valid or whether or not it corresponds to reality. And we defend or understand this by referring back to laws of logic.
How did you get into Dash?
I don't know. I'm not sure. It's pretty cool though.
I'm just saying.
So basically all of our ideas, all the arguments we make, making an argument in general requires that we go back to laws of logic. That's always the necessary presupposition for any argument. You have to go back to laws of logic. The problem with the laws of logic is that there are a lot of people out there who question the laws of logic, whether or not they exist, whether or not they function. So, for instance, someone who questions laws of logic says that you can have a bachelor that is married, when the bachelor is by definition an unmarried man. Well, that's kind of a problem. It's a contradiction. And so basically what the person is either saying is that that exists, or that the laws of logic that can actually occur, or that the laws of logic fail to account for that. And other ideas may be like a square circle. Those things are obviously contradictions, and to most of us those would sound absurd. But there are people who say, well, those could probably exist. So because of that, we can't just assume the laws of logic to exist. We have to demonstrate that they are valid and that we are justified in using them as a presupposition. But to do that, we're kind of running into a bind because we have to use the laws of logic to prove the laws of logic. And because of this, we run into a fallacy, actually two fallacies. Fallacy is a misuse of logic. For instance, a fallacy, the argumentum ad hominem, which means attacking the man. You say, I believe this and this and this. Well, you're wrong because you're stupid. That's a fallacy. And it's probably the most common fallacy, but it's a fallacy. It's a misuse of logic that has nothing to do with the argument at hand. Whether or not they're wrong does not have any bearing on whether or not they're stupid. The fallacies that we're dealing with are two, actually. One's called vicious circle, in which the justification for any proposition is sort of entailed within itself. So we run the laws of logic. We're like, all right, well, how do we argue with the laws of logic? Well, we have all these different ideas and claims, but ultimately those use logic, so we come back to logic. So we've just committed a fallacy. The other one is begging the question. Begging the question is basically having the truth of the conclusion of an argument entailed within its initial premises. So if we say, we have to use logic in order to defend logic, and then we conclude that logic exists and logic is valid. Well, it's begging the question because it's already up here, but then we have it down here also. You can't do that. So we have to figure out some way to ground logic in something, or that will enable us to use logic without depending entirely upon logic to justify it. Otherwise, we're begging the question, or committing a vicious circle. And this is a real problem because basically any statement we make or any argument we make depends upon logic. And without justifying it, we're basically committing a fallacy and invalidating any argument we make from the outset. So, I mean, this goes for atheists and theists alike. You know, if we advance an argument, we have to deal with this. So, how do we deal with this? Well, I can't really argue from the atheist point of view. Maybe one of you two will be able to offer some insight, but I maintain that the Christian worldview provides a coherent and pretty sound argument as to why we can use the laws of logic, and why they're authoritative, why they're valid.